Welcome back, guys. Today, we're not doing a M5 stuff, we're doing M6 stuff. This is a customer car from Texas, here for a bunch of things. It's kind of got some sentimental value to the owner. It was the first M car he ever drove, so he tracked it down and then bought it. But it needs rod bearings, injectors, throttle body actuators. We've got transmission fluid just pouring out of it. It doesn't really want to move under its own power. It doesn't want to stay running. When it does start, you can't restart it. So before we get too crazy spending thousands of dollars in parts and a bunch of time on it, we're gonna check the health of this motor. Of course, it's the E63 V10 here. So we're gonna be checking compression on it after we get it to start consistently so we can crank it for a compression test. Make sure it's got good compression, and then we'll be dropping the subframe in the oil pan so we can check the rod bearings on it, because if it's had a couple that have spun or there's an issue in the bottom end, again, don't want to spend a bunch of money on it. And then if all of that checks out, we'll move on to make it actually run and drive and do something about the transmission issues on it. So this is going to be quite the project here, so let's dig into it. All right, so we already have the intake plenums off. We're gonna do the throttle body actuators, the injectors, and replace that starter before we get going too far so we can do the compression test. Typically, we do the starter the BMW procedure way, which involves lowering the transmission so you can get to the top bolt on the starter. This one, what we're gonna do is what some of you may have seen on M539 restorations. It was mentioned in an M5 boards post where you can basically take all of the internals of the starter out from the top and then put the new internals in and not have to do anything with the bottom or lowering the transmission. We're gonna try that out. It's the first time we'll be doing it this way, so we'll see how it goes. All right, everything is out of the valley here except this pesky starter. So now we should have enough room to undo these bolts here and take the whole guts of the starter out and then put the new one in without having to drop the transmission or anything. Might need to vacuum up this sand and mouse poop. All right, starter is in. Hook up this jumper to it. Pour right here. So now we have this switch. And we can do some compression testing. But first we have to get all these old coils out. Cylinder 3. Number 4. 125. All right, final cylinder on bank 1, number 5. All right, on to bank 2, cylinder 6. Cylinder 7. Here we go. 125. All right, cylinder 8. Cylinder 9. $125. All right, final cylinder number 10 here. So here's our cylinder numbers, our results. So our highest cylinder is 125 and the lowest is 115. So looking at like an 8% variation between the highest and lowest. The rest of them are all well below that, so we're in spec. All right, now we're gonna put the new throttle body actuators in, swap injectors, possibly do the thermostat. Basically just overall proceed with reviving this M6. Let's go. Thermostat housing is off. We discovered it has definitely the wrong coolant in it. So we're gonna have to do a coolant system flush and change the thermostat. Taking off the injectors to get these refurbished today.
Benefit from some new O-rings.
All the injectors are out, ready to be packaged up and sent out. All right guys, so we have the injectors sent off. We're still waiting for throttle body actuators. So at this time, we're gonna get the fan out, lift the car up, start disassembly on the subframe so we can get to the rod bearings and Vanos pump. And then we also need to replace the oil cooler here, which we just received. We have a detailed DIY on the Outlaw Euro channel under the DIY section about removal of the subframe on the S85 cars because the M5 and the M6 are very much the same. So if you want to see like an in-depth detailed version, check out that video. We're going to kind of have this be the accelerated process and we'll see what we find. All right, so we're going to start with removing the fan here. The reason for that being, we need to take off the belts and the tensioners that attach to the oil pan, obviously to do the rod bearings, and then also to do the high pressure Vanos line. It's going to be a lot easier with the fan out. So we're going to start with that before raising it up and supporting the motor. So we're going to start by removing these T30s here along this line. So we can get this top piece out so we can get the fan out. And Brian's going to show you just how easy. This piece here is something that is different between the M5 and the M6. E63 M5 does not have that piece. The E63 M5 has a piece like this, where it doesn't have the big brackets going across here. Pretty obvious on this car because we put the more stainless style fittings in. So you can see exactly which ones you would need to undo to get this out of the way to get to the fan. Next off is this piece here. It completes the fan shroud. You definitely need that piece. You're gonna have higher than normal oil temperatures. But a couple T20s that hold it in and it comes right off. We now have access to get the fan out, clean up some of this. At this point, there are no other fasteners holding the fan on. You just gotta lift up, and then there's these little plastic doors down on each side, little wings you fold in. Obviously undo the electrical connector. And then really watch the coolant hoses in this corner, especially this guy. They like to break. All right, so now that the fan's out, we can get to the belts here. A couple of the tensioners. We can see through the bottom here, connect to the oil pan. So we have to get those out of the way. And then we'll also have better access to get to the high pressure Vanos line that is right through there. One belt off. Belt number 2. Another thing we're gonna do before putting the engine brace on and raising it up is right down here, motor mount bolts for both sides. It's a lot easier to disconnect the motor mounts now before the engine brace is in the way right here. Something else we're gonna need to do with this M6 is replace these air filters here. This is just not very becoming of a V10. All right, with the motor mount nuts off, it's time for the engine brace. So according to the new TIS procedure from BMW, it's supposed to use an engine brace that grabs this back hook also. From our experience, doing the one brace and then sometimes we'll throw a screw jack to support the transmission. Seems to hold it up. At this point, it's time to raise it up and start removing the subframe. All right, so here's the subframe we're gonna be removing. On this, we have a full step-by-step DIY on the Outlaw Euro page. So we're just kind of time-lapse our way through this. Alright, so subframe removal is underway. Disconnected the tie rods, sway bar links, control arms. Found this. Got new control arms for the front, those four. The oil cooler here is leaking, which is pretty common on the S85 cars. So we got another one of those. Throttle body actuators are on their way. Vanos pumps on the way. Injectors are getting cleaned. It's gonna be a whole different M6 by the time we're done. OSHA approved ladder here. So we got this seat belt wrapped to the steering wheel, holding it in place, so when we disconnect the steering shaft from the rack to pull the subframe down with the rack, the steering shaft is not going to move. And then once the steering shaft moves, as long as you have that plastic cap on there, it's got an alignment tab on it, it's not such a big deal. But if, let's say, that's broken or comes off, then you're kind of in a world of hurt, because you have lots of degrees of rotation. If you get it off and you turn the steering wheel too far one direction, you can break the clock spring. Got the seat belt in place, holding it on. So there's the steering shaft. We got it so we can put a socket through there, take the bolt out, and then disconnect it. You guys see this black piece in between the shaft right there? That helps keep everything lined up. All right, with everything removed from the subframe, we're now ready to lower it down. Put our support in right there, and then we're gonna use a tranny jack to set the subframe on to undo the bolts. So here's the subframe out of the car. Found a little wasp nest. Throw that out there for now. There we go. One step closer to seeing the rod bearings. So this subframe is pretty dirty. We're gonna take this over to the other side so we can clean it. Currently we have something in the way though. Alright, now that we move that out of the way, we can put the subframe here to get it cleaned up. But first, let's take a moment to just So 15 minutes later, with a little bit of solvent and a couple brushes, subframe is looking much better. All the residue of years of oil leaks, coolant leaks, road debris, grime, all that stuff has now been cleaned off. This is something we do pretty much every time we drop a subframe. Good to take a few moments to get everything all cleaned up. Helps when you're going back together with it. Then everything you're working with is a lot cleaner. Customers usually appreciate it, and then overall it just helps add to the cleanliness of the vehicle and the condition of it. So not looking too bad. While I was cleaning the subframe, Brian got all the oil pan bolts out and everything disconnected from it, so we should be ready to drop the pan. Alright, so here's our first looks inside this M6's engine. We're gonna finally see what the first bearing on the M6 looks like. Alright, so here's the top of number 4, the first rod we took off. Alright, so here's some of the parts we have for the M6. Obviously got the ARP rod bolts with the assembly lube, ACL race bearings, the injectors from the car freshly cleaned, rebuilt throttle body actuators, high pressure Vanos lines, some electric oil pump gaskets, thermostat we already installed, freshly rebuilt Vanos pump from Dr. Vanos, the oil that's going to be going back in the car, all of the front control arms, oil pan gasket, power steering fluid, CH11S there, and then this washer reservoir that we're going to need to clean up a little bit. Okay, got a couple more bearings out here. Getting close to the halfway point. Some signs of wear. Alright, so all the rod bearings are out of the M6 here. Definitely got some more on the top, but that's pretty common. Here, all of the bearings have been replaced with the ACL race bearings, and then the ARP rod bolts torqued to 50 foot-pounds, and then obviously I have assembly lube on the bearings too. But the bearings done, we can now move over to the high pressure Vanos pump. And on this one, we're gonna measure the backlash of the Vanos gear here, where it meets the crank gear. So you can see on camera, there's a little bit of movement. We use a test indicator. It's a smaller form of measurement than a dial indicator. So we're gonna get the most precise adjustment possible, but we're gonna see what the backlash is of this one before we take the pump out. Here's the test indicator we're gonna use. And then this is the magnetic base. But since the S85 block is all aluminum, we're gonna bolt this piece of steel in there using the oil pan bolts, then put the magnetic base onto here, and we'll have this for the test indicator to go on to measure the backlash. All right, here's the backlash gauge set up and installed. And so I have the test indicator going up to the gear on the Vanos here. Try to get so you guys can see. So I'm just gonna take the Vanos gear, move it side to side for the free play. You can see on the gauge, it's about 4 thousandths. So it's actually kind of tight for the spec. It's 0.06 to 0.08, and we're at 0.04, so a little bit tight. But now we're gonna go ahead and remove the Vanos pump and the Vanos chain and the guides for it. All right, here's the Vanos tensioner. This guide here holds it in, and the spring and the plunger, plus this other very small piece, go up in this hole. So when you undo that, make sure that you get all 3 pieces. That small piece we'll show you here once we find it. They like to get stuck up inside that hole. All right, now that we have the Vanos pump removed, we can remove the high pressure Vanos line, but we're gonna have to unattach it from up there. All right, so we lowered the M6 down a little bit, have a little stool. Still can't really see the high pressure Vanos line, but it's back there. So we have to move the secondary air hose out of the way, this T-line for the Vanos that goes to each of the adjustment units on either bank. And then there's 2 bolts right here. So we're gonna have to remove the water pump pulley to get to them. These bolts were only finger tight. All right, with the water pump pulley out of the way, but Brian's glove in the way, you can see the 2 bolts right there and there. High pressure Vanos line is out. Now it's time to put the new Vanos line in, along with the new rebuilt pump from Dr. Vanos. Now it's kind of a pain to put the Vanos line in because of these bends right here. Obviously you can't fit this through the hole, so you gotta put this end in first, and then you're gonna be kind of running it down the front of the block. So then it pops out like so at the bottom, and you kind of put it to the side like that, so the Vanos pump will go on, and then this will bolt right to the pump. And this is the part on the Vanos line that likes to rupture and lose Vanos oil pressure. Here's the plunger for the Vanos timing I was talking about. Pretty small guy. And this is the Vanos chain tensioner assembly. See, it just goes up in there like so. Here's our freshly rebuilt Dr. Vanos pump going in. All right, so we're only putting the Vanos pump and torquing it to 2 Newton meters so we can hit it with a little mallet if we need to tighten it or loosen it. All right, so we have the test indicator set up again. I'll test the backlash here. It's still kind of on the tight side. So to add more backlash, we use the mallet and we kind of push the pump that way. If we wanted to tighten it up and remove backlash, we hit it this way. So it looks like we're gonna have to add just a little bit more. All right, so we're right in the spec, right between 6 and 8. Settled on lucky number 7. So all right, now all we have to do is put the tensioner and the guides and everything else for the Vanos in. Obviously get the high pressure Vanos line bolted to the pump right here. We should be done with the bottom end on it. All right, Vanos pumps installed, rod bearings and rod bolts are installed. Pretty much wraps up the bottom end. So now all we have to do is get the oil pan back on. When we put the subframe back in, replace these blown out control arms and move on to the next part of restoring this M6. All right, so the rod bearings are in, rod bolts are in, high pressure Vanos pumps in, control arms are in, subframe's back in. But before we start on the top, we got to do something about this leaking oil cooler. When I did our part list before, I forgot to mention brand new oil cooler. This oil cooler was definitely leaking, but luckily got the new oil cooler here ready to go. Brian cleaned up the cover for it, ready to install. So here's 5 of the refurbished injectors for the M6. The other 5 already in. And then we went ahead and cleaned up the throttle bodies too. They were full of carbon buildup. Here's a little printout from RC Fuel Injection on the injectors that were in the car. As you can see here, here's the first 5. Number 1 was dripping, 2 and 3 were fair, 4 and 5 were dripping. And over here we got a couple more that are dripping and a couple more that are fair. And then here's before and after. But as most of you know, on the S85 motors, kind of a big issue if one of the injectors sticks open and then hydrolocks the motors. So glad we're getting ahead of this now. And with all the injectors in, it's now time for our rebuilt throttle body actuators from Euro Power, formerly Empower Motorsports. This is another pretty common failure point for the S85 and the S65. All three of our E60 M5s have had throttle body actuator issues. We've had to replace them, so another preventative maintenance item for the M6 here. Real quick before we put the plenums on, we're gonna go for a little side quest here. Remember earlier in the video we had a really bright green coolant going on? Well, it's leaking out of this sensor. We need to drain the coolant anyway though, so we're gonna undo the radiator drain while we're putting the plenums on. All right, so the highest point that we found a coolant leak was from this sensor here and from this hose. So we replaced the O-rings on both of those. And then we filled it with the proper blue BMW coolant. Also, the plenums are on, the air boxes are on. We're cleaning up as pretty much everything that we touch, we're cleaning and putting it back on. So it's starting to look like a proper M car now. Still have to do a little work on the outside and still have to do some stuff with the transmission, but at this point, now that the high pressure Vanos pumps in, high pressure Vanos lines in, rod bearings, rod bolts, thermostat, throttle body actuators, injectors, since all of that stuff is in, along with fixing our coolant leak and having the proper coolant in it, we're now gonna add some oil, start it up, see how it runs, and then we'll start diving into the SMG issues. All right guys, so we have all the engine work done that we're gonna be doing to it. But as you saw, we still have some transmission issues. All right guys, that's all for part 1 on restoring this M6. Stay tuned for part 2. Don't forget to smash the like and subscribe button. Watch our progress getting this V10 back on the road.